matter what Bernard did, he always wore a jacket and tie. And you see him here throwing in the studio with a white shirt and a tie on.
People sometimes ask me, how do you know when it's in the middle of the wheel? And one's almost stumped to answer, because the answer lies so very much in the doing. As soon as it's steady and unmoving, silent as I called it, it's obviously centered.
A Potter's book by Bernard Leach. It had just been published in America. And so we all tried to get a copy of this book, and we read it, and we said, boy, this is exciting.
The Potter's book was my Bible, and I fell in love with the pots that Leach made, his philosophy.
It was a big part of what made better standards in American pottery.
And we tried to throw a pot on the potter's wheel. Of course, we made a mess. We had wasted clay. We had clay all over the place, and we almost got thrown out of school. But it did get us started. One day, my first wife, Alex, and I contacted Leach and asked him if we could come and talk about apprenticing with him. We went to England and spent 2.5 years there at the pottery.
This amateur film about the Leach pottery was taken in 1952 by my two American students, Warren and Alex MacKenzie. The idea was to make a visual recording of the normal sequence of work at our pottery at St. Ives, for the sake largely of students and other potters who either have not the opportunity to visit us or who want to see how we have attempted to assimilate Oriental tradition and technique to suit our English needs.
We were not making our own pots. We were making Leach pottery pots. And those, what we called standardware pots, were illustrated in a catalog.
I became an apprentice, this is 1968. Bernard Leach was 82 at the time. He worked every day in the studio. He had a private space upstairs, and we were told to not disturb him. It was his time to work. And we'd see him at tea time. They started me out on a fairly simple, what I thought was a simple shape. And it was a humbling experience. I cut my teeth on this lidded soup bowl. I made these for 2 months before they reached a certain standard where they could be sold.
We were on a 3-week firing schedule, so we made pots for 2 weeks. Then we stopped and had glazed chores and firing duties. And then we started all over again. Lovely rhythm, very supportive rhythm. But we also had the freedom to stay after work and to go up on weekends and make our own pots. And Bernard would critique them.
And the cutting of the foot is something that we have learnt and are still learning from our Eastern masters.
Leach was in Japan studying. He met Hamada. They became friends. And they became part of this Minge movement together. Minge is a made-up word. I think they said that this group made the word up. It has to do with being people's art, folk art. And they had this anonymous quality of the fact that the potters were simply doing a job. They were doing a job like we would talk about an auto mechanic repairing our car. He doesn't do it with any great panache or anything, but we want it to be right, you know? And that's the way they wanted their work to be. It just had to be right. And when Leach was invited to return to England and start a pottery. Hamada said, "I will go with you." And so he went to England with Leach, and they built the pottery together. They went out and found clays that would work. They found a supply of wood to burn in the kilns. And in fact, Hamada lived in the main building of the pottery. That was his bedroom. And he had a handmade bed that he made that was still there when we were there.
Hamada Leach meshed perfectly because out of this idea they had of East and West meeting and coming to some new kind of sense of what the human race could evolve into. To those ideas of opening up cross-cultural references, how everybody gains when we are open to the other.
Now, how do I put it? I think Hamada was a much better potter than Leach. But the reason for that is Leach was a much better draftsman than he was a potter. Bernard brought pots to life in his sketches. And then when he made the pot, he was simply copying the drawing, but doing it with clay. Hamada made his pots on the wheel, and that's where they were created.
SHOJI HAMADA was a genius, you know. So in spite of my continuing to want to define this whole thing as craft as opposed to art, some people surpass it. The lusciousness, the robustness, the materials, everything about it was just wonderful. So sumptuous and wonderful. Certainly part of Asian pottery is that wonderful business of capitalizing on the accidental, the fortuitous accident. I think it's characteristic that all Leach-trained potters and all their offspring want to explore. The whole point is kind of setting up a situation where the fortuitous accident can happen and learning how to coax it into being on a more and more frequent basis.
Leach was going to go back to Japan with Hamada, but they decided instead of returning via the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, and so on past India to Japan, they would continue west and cross the Atlantic, cross America, and then go to Japan from California. My wife said to them, "Well, look, if you people are going to go crossing America, would you be willing to do some workshops in America?" Hamada thought for a while. He said, "If you'll arrange them, we will do them."
They swept through the United States at a time when people were hungry for what they had to offer.
Up until that time, functional pots were not recognized as an art form. Hamada and Leach did bring with them the pottery aesthetic, but also the philosophy of how you lived your life. And with that, then a group of us from the 60s moved out into the country. I remember coming back from England and not having a role model how to run a pottery. I modeled after the Leach pottery. I tried to do standard ware and then individual pots, and the standard ware just failed. No, the shops wouldn't buy them. One shop bought some standard ware. They never sent a check. So it just flopped. That was really a blessing in disguise because it brought me to making the pots that I really wanted to make in my heart.
The altered form is, to me, how Hamada leach might have diverged in America away from the way it took form in England. And I would say in America, starting in the 70s, potters started looking at the form as it is on the wheel and altering it both on the wheel and off the wheel into a new form. Strictly American. I don't think it's ever hit amongst the potters of Britain at all, the way it is a common thing in America.
I grew in love with altering about 25 years ago when I went from gas firing to wood firing. And I realized after all the labor of cutting the wood, of cleaning the shelves up, of wadding, stacking, and then the brutality of firing for hours and hours and hours, that I wanted to invest more time in each piece. And I developed altering techniques. It's not about production pots. I've been there, done that. It's about each pot being different but cousins. By the end of the day, I'm wiped out because of all the thinking I'm doing, what goes into the piece. I want each one to be unique. When I was teaching a summer class at Alfred in 1985, and I challenged the students to come up with a new spout idea, and I also took the assignment. I thought of the pump in my grandfather's cabin in rural Minnesota. As a kid, I loved to pump water from that. It was magic. So I took that exact same shape, I put it on a pitcher. It did not pour. So what can I do? So I had to modify it, and come up with a spout that would pour. Again, function was important. And it evolved into one of my signature pieces, the beaked pitcher.
The pots I make today would never have been accepted by the Leach pottery in 1952 because they wouldn't come up to their standard. But for me, they're the pots I have to make. A potter has an attitude about the way he or she approaches clay, and it inevitably comes out. When we came home from the Leach pottery, having spent 2 years, 2.5 years, making someone else's pots without a desire for expression in them, you know. It took us about 3 years to get over that quality in our work.
Since I was at St. Ives, my throwing technique hasn't changed. Adding the decoration in it is something new to me. The sgraffito work that I'm doing is completely new to me. And I don't know that I have technique. I do it as well as I can. What I hope I'm doing, and can't always achieve it, is playing. I'm out to amuse myself and amuse others without it going cute. It may go cute from time to time, but I want to evoke not a dated cuteness, but cuteness of yore, if you would have it. Then the face thing just exploded and it's been through millions of ramifications for me. You've always got that 2 eyes, nose, mouth pattern, and it just divides up space in an endless variety of ways. And then you get the extra bonus of any human face being expressive. But it's not art with a capital A. It's decoration on top of utilitarian pots. And I've always been most comfortable in that arena.
She has this strong commitment to her local clientele. One time, Clary called me up and said, "Gail, please don't send collectors to my studio or my showroom."
That's Clary. The strong principles of the leach principles of the pots being for local consumption, and the pots be very reasonably priced and affordable to all. And she has stuck with those principles for decades.
I would imagine that in talking with those of us who are leach trained potters, you've been hearing quite a bit about the past. And I almost wish we could abolish that word, because I think what we're about is the continuum.
Oh, good, this can be large enough, don't you think? What we'll do is set it on there. When I think of the joy in my life as a potter, it's not the awards, the accolades, it's teaching Charlie, it's passing it on. Let's try one more time. Perfect.
First learned about Warren when I was an undergrad at Bemidji State, and we had Warren's pots in our collection there, and learning about Warren and the leach tradition was part of our curriculum. A lot of the lines and stuff come from a lot of the work, your jars, that you... he's had these students that have gone on to become potters and teachers, and then they have had students. Warren laid down such a rock-solid foundation and built a culture around the functional pot.
Yeah, there's something that affects you. You know, they're part of your life if you let them be.
I think in just these troubled times now that these crafts and what we live with are even more important to us. It just connects us, and it just brings out our humanity.
And the direction in which, both as craftsmen and ordinary members of community, we are attempting to find a way in which the function of art can find its modern expression in closer contact with life.